Welcome to the video. If you're excited for what's coming up, give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe. Let's jump into it.
Suho's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he stared at the countless flames flickering all around him, their eerie glow casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. His mind struggled to grasp the implications, and with a furrowed brow, he muttered under his breath, "Don't tell me, each one of these torches is a life?" His own words sent a shiver through him. Was that a good thing? Did that mean he had more than one chance? But then, as the thought settled, his expression darkened, and his chest tightened with dread. There was no way to confirm if these torches actually represented his extra lives, or worse, if they belonged to something else entirely. And even if they were his lives, what good were they if he had no way to level up? He clenched his fists, gritting his teeth in frustration. There's no way for me to grow stronger here. Then what the hell am I supposed to do? His gaze snapped toward the glitching system notifications still hovering in his vision. The message flashed again. An error has occurred in the system due to the invasion of substances from another world. His fingers twitched slightly as he processed those words. So that was it. That had to be why this quest was so impossibly unfair. His eyes darted to the other two messages. Defeat the being beyond the gate before you run out of all the given lives. You are unable to exit the dungeon until the class change is completed. Suho frowned deeply, his hands tightening into fists. If the system was glitched, then there was no guarantee these torches actually counted as extra lives. For all he knew, he could already be on his final chance. But no matter how much fear clawed at his gut, no matter how impossible the situation felt, he refused to give up. His body was still trembling from his last death, from the feeling of his neck being violently snapped, but he forced himself to move forward. His feet felt heavy, but he pushed forward anyway, his voice steady as he muttered, "I have to move forward, no matter what." His eyes flickered across the maze of twisting hallways, irregular passageways, and strangely placed boss room gates. Something about this entire dungeon felt off. It was designed in a way that made no logical sense. He narrowed his eyes deep in thought. If there are other boss rooms aside from the two I've seen, then how big is this maze? A sharp wave of unease crawled up his spine as he bit down on his lip. I do have time, so if I search carefully, maybe I can. His words cut off abruptly as a terrible sensation slammed into him. His entire body went stiff, and his breath hitched as he felt something. A presence. A deep, suffocating presence lurking in the darkness ahead. His hands clenched as he slowly turned his gaze toward the shadowy corridor in front of him. At first, he saw nothing. The silence stretched on, thick and unbearable. But then, something moved. A small object floated out from the pitch-black darkness, barely visible at first. It hovered eerily in midair, moving unnaturally, its shape flickering under the dim torchlight. His eyes focused, and his stomach twisted violently. It was a toy. The realization sent a bolt of terror shooting through his veins. And then, more began to emerge. One by one, more floating toys drifted out from the darkness, each one levitating effortlessly. And then, at the center of them all, the real nightmare appeared. Baby Suho. The small, child version of him floated silently, surrounded by the eerie swarm of toys, his face shadowed, his eyes glowing with an unnatural gleam of power. Suho's blood turned to ice as his body locked up in sheer terror. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his pulse hammering in his ears. Why is he here? His voice cracked as he instinctively took a step back, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Did he leave the boss room? Did he come through the open gate? His gut screamed at him to run. Without wasting another second, Suho turned on his heel and bolted. His heart pounded as he sprinted through the maze-like corridors, his mind filled with nothing but a single desperate thought: I need to get away. But before he could even make it 5 steps, something ripped into him. A sickening, tearing sound filled the air. A sharp, excruciating pain erupted in his leg. His body collapsed violently onto the cold stone floor as a gaping wound tore through his calf, blood pouring freely from the severed flesh. He barely managed to catch himself before his face slammed into the ground, his breath coming out in ragged gasps as his vision blurred from the pain. His trembling hands clutched at his shredded leg, his teeth gritting as agony tore through him. His eyes darted toward the cause of his wound, and that's when he saw it. One of the floating toys had attacked him. Or rather, it had exploded on impact. His stomach churned in horror. Did his toy just blow my leg apart? He turned his gaze back to baby Suho, who still hovered calmly in midair. The amount of sheer power in his ruler's authority was monstrous. Suho's lips parted in shock, his pupils shaking. If he can generate this much speed and precision with just his ability alone, how am I supposed to clear this? But before he could even begin to formulate an answer, a new terror arrived. A second presence loomed behind him. Suho's blood froze. A shadow stretched over his fallen form. A slow, methodical footstep echoed against the dungeon floor, followed by an oppressive, suffocating aura of pure power. He knew who it was before he even turned around. And when he did, his soul nearly left his body. Standing behind him, radiating an overwhelmingly lethal aura, was none other than Tutorial Suho. Terror, unlike anything he had ever felt before, gripped him like a vice. He was already crippled from baby Suho's attack, and now, his past self, the one who had annihilated him in a single strike before, stood before him once again. His body trembled uncontrollably as a shuddering breath escaped him, his voice barely above a whisper, raw with desperation and fear. No way! But there was no time to act. No time to beg for mercy. No time to even think. Tutorial Suho didn't waste a single second. With one devastating, merciless swing of his Vulcan gauntlets, he severed Suho's head from his body. Suho respawned once again, his body materializing in the same dimly lit starting location. The moment he gained form, frustration exploded inside him. His fist clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palm before he slammed his knuckles against the cold stone wall. His hands slowly moved to his forehead, dragging down his face as he exhaled heavily, trying to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. His voice was thick with frustration as he muttered, "This is complete. The bosses could just roam around freely. What kind of impossible difficulty is this?" He took another shaky breath before another thought slammed into him. His father. Did he go through this? Was this insane, hellish quest something that even his father had endured? But then, realization struck. His eyes widened for a brief moment before a sharp grin spread across his face. His frustration didn't disappear, but it was quickly replaced with something far more valuable. Determination. His fingers curled into a tight fist, a fire igniting in his gaze as he smirked. Wait, if I'm reviving every time, that means all those torches are actually my lives. He exhaled sharply through his nose. Then, as long as my clear condition is to defeat a being inside a boss room, there's no need for me to actually win against those two. I just have to keep trying until I find a different room. His newfound determination, however, didn't change the brutal reality of the situation. Yet again, he found himself face to face with Tutorial Suho. The cold, unforgiving gaze of his past self locked onto him like a predator fixated on prey. Before Suho could even blink, Tutorial Suho launched forward, his movement faster than a bullet. Suho barely had time to register the incoming attack before the impact obliterated him completely. No trace of his body remained. Again and again, he was revived, only to die moments later. Sometimes, it was baby Suho, floating eerily in the air, his small hand casually flicking his fingers to tear Suho's limbs apart with invisible force. Other times, it was Tutorial Suho, ending him in a single, merciless strike. Blown apart. Decapitated. Crushed. Snapped like a twig. His deaths were brutal. Relentless. Ceaseless. But no matter how many times he was ripped apart, Suho gritted his teeth and kept going. It's fine. I can die as many times as I need to. That thought alone kept him moving. If his lives were infinite, then as long as he continued searching, he would eventually find another boss room. But then, another horrifying thought crept in. His breath faltered. His pulse skipped. What if, because of the system error, there are no other boss rooms? That single doubt lodged itself in his mind like a dagger. What if this wasn't just a battle of endurance? What if there was no escape at all? Suho found himself sitting on the floor, his back slumped against the cold stone wall. His breathing was heavy, his body still trembling slightly from the countless deaths he had endured. His fists were curled so tightly that his nails bit into his skin, drawing blood. His mind wasn't just tired, it was being crushed under the weight of a hopeless reality. Infinite lives. Enemies he couldn't defeat. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, true despair crept into his expression. This is hell. His mind raced as he tried to piece together a way forward. He had faced many impossible situations before, had stared death in the face and survived. But this, a world where he could die endlessly, unable to grow, unable to escape. His teeth clenched as he bit his lip in frustration, hard enough that blood pooled in his mouth. He wiped the blood away with his thumb, staring at the crimson stain on his skin as a memory resurfaced. His own words he had spoken with absolute confidence. If I'm going to get stronger, then I want to be the strongest. His grip on reality tightened. Those words now bind me. A rough exhale escaped him as he ran a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. Damn it! He cursed himself, for feeling weak, for even letting despair crawl into his mind. No. That wasn't him. He wasn't someone who just gave up. If there was no way forward, then he would make one. He lowered his hand to the ground, pressing his bloodied finger against the cold stone. With slow, calculated movements, he began to draw on the floor, using his own blood. His voice was steady, controlled, yet held a dangerous edge of desperation. Fine then. I'll do what I can. I'll draw a path. Every time I die, I'll mark the places I've been. His eyes hardened with resolve. I won't give up. Meanwhile, in the outside world, breaking news spread like wildfire. The Hunters Association had officially prohibited the use of stardust. Reports surfaced revealing that numerous hunters had suffered severe memory loss after consuming the substance. An official investigation had been launched, with authorities tracking down those responsible for its distribution. Then, another shocking revelation. Breaking news: former Vice Guild Master of Reaper Guild, Lee Min-sung, found dead on a mountain. The news headline dominated every media outlet. A hiker had discovered the lifeless body of Lee Min-sung early that morning. The world was in shock. The once praised hero of the hunters, the former celebrity warrior, had been at the center of a massive drug operation. The betrayal cut deep, especially for those who had once admired him. The Reaper Guild released a public statement, pledging full cooperation with the Hunters Association in the investigation. The world was changing. Taijaya sat in the meeting room, his fingers pinching the bridge of his nose as he exhaled a long, frustrated sigh. His mind was drowning in what-ifs, his past failures looping like a broken record. Finally, he lowered his hand and leaned forward, his voice laced with regret as he muttered, "This is all my fault." He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palm. If only I hadn't lost Lee Min-sung back then, none of this would have happened. Across from him, the chairman of the Hunters Association watched him carefully before speaking in a firm but supportive tone. Don't be too hard on yourself, Hunter Taijaya. But Taijaya barely acknowledged the words. His thoughts were spiraling, and his frustration only grew sharper as he laced his fingers together in front of his lips. His voice was eerily calm, but his narrowed eyes revealed the storm of thoughts inside his mind. There are strange details about Min-sung's death. The chairman's brows furrowed slightly. Taijaya continued, his tone low. When they found his body, his appearance was unnatural. But the thing is, he never had any transformation skills. So how did it happen? Choi, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his gaze sharpening. Are you suggesting that stardust created some kind of new skill? His voice was careful, but there was a noticeable weight behind the words. Taijaya gritted his teeth. The pieces of this puzzle didn't fit together neatly, and that fact unsettled him. I can't say for sure, but it's possible. He hesitated for a moment before adding. And there's something else. The room tensed. There was another hunter involved, a man in a black mask. He was fighting Lee Min-sung before his death. Choi's eyes flickered with recognition as he turned his attention fully to him. His voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it. Then that person may have been the one to kill him. The room fell into a tense silence. The chairman remained deep in thought, his expression unreadable. A hunter in a black mask. That detail stuck out to him, like a glitch in the system. His mind raced through possibilities, but nothing concrete formed. Then, Choi reached into his pocket, pulling out a small photograph. His fingers tapped against the image for a moment before he finally placed it down on the table. His tone remained calm, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Speaking of which, one of the miners who joined the expedition is now reported missing. The photograph slid across the table. A single name was printed beneath it. Suho. Taijaya and the chairman exchanged looks, their expressions darkening. Choi continued, his fingers tapping against the wood as he spoke, his voice growing more serious. Officially, he's listed as a low-level hunter. But given everything that's happened, there's a strong chance that he's a false ranker. The weight of those words hung in the air. From the far end of the table, the apostle finally reacted. Up until now, he had merely been listening, his presence eerily quiet. But at the mention of Suho's name, he leaned forward slightly. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something dangerous behind his eyes. His voice was cold, devoid of emotion, as he finally spoke. "May I see the picture?" Choi glanced at him before nodding. "Of course. You're involved in this incident as well, Hunter Park Dojin." Without hesitation, the apostle picked up the photograph, turning it in his hand. His sharp gaze lingered on Suho's face, taking in every detail. His fingers slowly rested over the lower half of the image, covering Suho's mouth. A second passed. Then, a sinister grin stretched across his face. In that moment, he knew. The black-masked hunter was Sung Suho. And now, he had a target. Deep within the twisting labyrinth of the dungeon, Suho sat on the cold stone floor, his back resting against the wall. His breathing was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Focused. The floor around him was covered in a massive, hand-drawn map, sketched in his own blood. Every passage he had explored. Every path he had taken. Every death he had suffered. All of it, meticulously recorded. His fingers ran along the markings, tracing the lines over and over again, filtering through the information like an AI running millions of calculations. This was no longer a chaotic maze. It was a puzzle. And somewhere within it, the answer was hiding. For the longest time, he stared at the blood-stained markings. His breathing slowed. Then, his eyes narrowed. His mind clicked. His grip on his knee tightened. A slow, knowing smirk crept onto his face. His shoulders squared. His posture straightened. The faint traces of frustration vanished. As if the pieces had finally fallen into place. All this time, he had thought he was stuck in an impossible loop of death. But now, he looked as if he found the way forward. This wasn't just blind survival anymore. Now, he was hunting for the exit. And he wouldn't stop until he found it.
We got plenty more where that came from. Hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for even more amazing content.